Today, we're diving into the fascinating colonial period of Australia. So, picture this. It's the late 18th century, and Australia is being used by the British as a penal colony. But what exactly does that mean? Well, it all started in 1788, when the British sent convicts to establish settlements in places like Sydney Cove and Norfolk Island. To keep things in check, they stationed Marines there until 1790, when they brought in a special unit just for colonial service. Fast forward to 1810, and the 73rd Regiment of Foot became the first official line regiment to serve in Australia. Now, let's talk about the troops. They weren't just there to fend off kangaroos. Their main gig was to maintain order, especially against convict uprisings and resistance from the Aboriginal population. Fun fact, British soldiers rarely had to fight other Europeans during their time in Australia, but there were a few notable incidents, like the Castle Hill Rebellion in 1804 and the Eureka Stockade in 1854. But here's where it gets really interesting. While the troops in Australia weren't constantly battling, their comrades across the Tasman Sea were in the thick of it during the Anglo-Maori Wars. These wars erupted due to European settlers encroaching on Maori land and the colonial government's push to squash native independence. In 1845, the 58th Regiment of Foot, which was actually based in Australia at the time, was sent over to New Zealand to help out. Fighting simmered down in 1846, but flared up again in 1860. By 1863, things were getting serious, and New Zealand called for backup from Australia. Cue the British troops invading the Waikato area, with news of the campaign spreading through the Australian colonies like wildfire. Now, here's where it gets really cool. Around 2,500 volunteers from Australia signed up to help out, lured in by the promise of land in New Zealand. They joined various regiments and even became bush guerrillas. While most didn't see major battles, their contribution was crucial during this tumultuous time. Now, despite the heavy presence of British troops, the Aussies were also getting organized on the military front. Way back in 1788, the Commandant of Norfolk Island, Philip Gidley King, was already prepping for action, ordering his 6 free male settlers to practice musketry on Saturdays. Talk about being proactive. Fast forward to 1800, and Governor Hunter in Sydney was like, "Hey, we need to be ready just in case those Irish convicts decide to kick up a fuss." So he gathered 100 free male settlers and formed loyal associations, basically volunteer units to keep the peace. Then, in 1806, Governor King recruited 6 ex-convicts to create Australia's first full-time military unit. Talk about resourcefulness. But it wasn't until 1854 that we saw a resurgence in volunteer units, thanks to news of the Crimean War. Suddenly, everyone was like, "We gotta be ready for anything." So, rifle clubs popped up left and right, especially with rumors of Napoleon III eyeing up England. Come 1860, every suburban town had its own volunteer unit, usually a rifle corps. These guys were serious about defending their turf. And as the century rolled on, these volunteer corps got more organized, with proper training from the pros. Now, let's talk about the late 1800s. Strikes were popping off left and right, so thousands of citizen soldiers were mobilized to keep the peace. Then, in 1899, they got their chance to prove themselves in the Boer War. Talk about stepping up when duty calls. Finally, in 1901, after Federation, the administration of military forces shifted to the Commonwealth. But here's the thing. While a lot of military training was aimed at external threats, there was another quieter conflict happening right here on Aussie soil. Since European settlement, there was this ongoing, undeclared war against Australia's indigenous peoples. It wasn't like big battles you see in movies. It was more localized and sporadic, spreading across the continent as settlers moved further inland. British soldiers didn't get involved much. It was mostly settlers and police doing the fighting. So yeah, while the military was gearing up for external threats, there was this whole other struggle happening closer to home. Now, let's talk about a darker chapter in Australia's story, the clash between European settlers and Aboriginal Australians. It all started with a kind of uneasy peace. At first, the Aboriginal people were curious about these new arrivals and sometimes even welcomed them. But as time went on, it became clear that the settlers were there to stay, and trouble began brewing. See, there was this competition for land. The settlers wanted to farm and raise livestock, but that meant encroaching on the traditional lands of the Aboriginal people. Tensions rose as the two ways of life collided. When the settlers' actions became too much for the indigenous population to bear, violence erupted. It wasn't just isolated incidents either. When one person was killed, it often led to revenge attacks from the other side. Sometimes, these clashes turned into full-blown battles, usually with the Europeans coming out on top. But the Aboriginal people weren't about to give up without a fight. In the rugged terrain of Australia, guerrilla tactics became the norm for Aboriginal resistance. They'd ambush settlers, attack their livestock, and sabotage supply lines. It was a form of warfare born out of necessity, but the toll of this conflict was immense. It's estimated that around 2,500 European settlers and police lost their lives. For the Aboriginal inhabitants, the cost was even higher. Around 20,000 are believed to have been killed in these frontier wars, and many more died from diseases brought by the settlers or other unintended consequences of colonization. Despite their efforts, the Aboriginal Australians couldn't stop the tide of European settlement. While resistance continued in various forms, the end result was the dispossession of the indigenous peoples from their lands. As European settlement expanded across Australia, so did the conflicts with Aboriginal peoples. The dispossession of land and the imposition of European ways of life led to widespread resistance and violence. One notable conflict was the Hawkesbury and Nepean Wars in the early 19th century, where indigenous groups fought against British settlers encroaching on their land along the Hawkesbury River. Throughout the 19th century, various massacres occurred as European settlers sought to assert control over the land. These massacres, such as the Myall Creek Massacre in 1838, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Aboriginal men, women, and children. In response to the violence and dispossession, Aboriginal resistance leaders emerged, such as Pemawui, who led attacks against settlers in the Sydney region in the late 18th century, and Yagan, a Noongar leader who resisted British colonization in Western Australia in the early 19th century. The frontier wars continued well into the late 19th century as European settlement expanded further inland. Aboriginal communities faced displacement from their traditional lands, loss of resources, and devastating impacts on their culture and way of life. Despite the profound and enduring impacts of colonization on Aboriginal peoples, resistance and resilience persisted. Aboriginal communities continued to assert their rights to land and self-determination, leading to significant social and political movements in the 20th and 21st centuries, including the land rights movement and the recognition of indigenous sovereignty. Following the frontier wars, Aboriginal communities grappled with the enduring legacy of colonization. Forced removal from traditional lands, restrictions on cultural practices, and the systemic marginalization within Australian society persisted well into the 20th century. This period of Australian history is complex and deeply impactful, shaping the country's social, cultural, and political landscape to this day. And thanks for tuning in to explore Australia's colonial history with me. If you found this video informative, don't forget to leave a comment, like, and subscribe for more content like this.